Welcome to Get Unstuck, Move Forward with Your Life. I am your host, Jason Hopcus. Thank you for joining us today. Today, Dan Newby is joining us. Dan is a champion for emotional literacy and works with leaders, educators, and coaches worldwide. His passion is helping emotional literacy become common sense and emotions a tool for daily use. He has authored 4 books on emotional literacy and its applications to coaching. He regularly leads his course, Emotions-Centered Coaching, for coaches and people who support people, including leaders, therapists, educators, faith leaders, and parents. He has worked with leaders in the U.S., Germany, Italy, El Salvador, Mexico, Slovakia, UK, Singapore, and Canada. He often combines individual and group work and is the originator of emotion-centered coaching. His training and mentoring of coaches occur primarily through his online training programs, virtual and live masterclasses. Dan, thank you for joining me today for another episode of Get Unstuck Radio.
Thank you, Jason. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm excited to, learn more about a topic that is so often overlooked, emotions. Tell us just kind of some backstory about how did you get involved in doing this work?
Well, I would say not dissimilar to your own story. I went through some very difficult years in my late 30s, my 40s, so roughly 25, 30 years ago. And I thought that, well, perhaps I had missed something, that I had missed an idea, or I'd missed some rule about life and how to live it. Or I thought, well, maybe life is just as hard. But in the end, what I discovered was that what I was really missing was any sort of understanding of my emotions and how those move me, the impulses they gave me, the information they were trying to give me. So I came to this work because I was looking for a solution for me personally. And then I found that it beautifully dovetailed with work I was doing in coaching and leadership development.
So I love that. And I do find most often we find our true passion and purpose in some painful experience. and it sounds like that was the case in your life. Help anybody who's listening. You use this word emotional literacy. Tell us really what that is. Help us unpack that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, you bet. Well, most of our lives, we're tested, we're evaluated, and we focus our learning on our intellect. So
Right.
We measure our IQ, and then we go to school, and we learn to read, we learn to write. We use literacy of language as a tool to help us access our intellect and also to strengthen it.
Okay.
And emotional literacy plays the same role, but with EQ, or emotional intelligence. And this is a belief among many people who write about emotional intelligence. It's not just my idea, but the fundamental idea is that, well, if we learn the basics of emotions in the same way we've learned the basics of linguistics in literacy, well, then they'll become available to us and we can use them as a tool. So for me, what we're doing, it's a very practical approach to how do we begin to understand our emotions? How do we leverage them? How do we listen to them? How do we use their wisdom to improve our lives? But it's not, it's a practice. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's not just knowing about emotions, but it's really rolling up your sleeves and learning about your emotions, experiencing your emotions, and in a way, just playing with your emotions. The fact that they're there as a tool, and that, if you were to pay attention to them and you had some respect for them, that they could do a lot for you. That right now they don't, simply because you don't pay attention to them.
And isn't it interesting that we get taught so many things in school and learn about, various subjects, but the thing that really becomes a guiding principle in our life, emotions, is something that is usually left out of most of conversations.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite expressions is we leave our emotional learning to chance. We hope people will learn emotionally. We hope our kids will, and we tell them to go to their rooms and come back when you're in a better mood. But we don't really have a way, most of us, of a methodology or a practical way of helping people learn emotions. And that's my work. That's what I believe we can do. And as it turns out, one of the things I've discovered is that emotions are quite logical. There's a pattern to them. It's always the same. It doesn't change. I think life is unpredictable, but emotions are actually much more predictable than we give them credit for. But one of the things that I've discovered working with people in every part of the world from every background is that there's a lot of what I would call myths or misapprehensions about emotions. We've learned to believe certain things about emotions that aren't necessarily true. They don't really stand up to study or to when we really look at them. I mean, the whole question of can we control our emotions? Well, I can't, and I work in this area. I don't know anybody who can. Nobody's ever been able to show me, well, here it is, step 1, 2, 3, if you want to control your emotions. And so I begin to think, well, maybe that's the wrong way to think about emotions. Maybe it's not about us controlling them. Maybe it's about us being in a dance with them. Maybe it's about us befriending them. Maybe it's about us seeing them as a tool to help us navigate life rather than something we need to dominate and control. So there's a lot of those. I think of them as myths about emotions that get in the way, I think, of us just simply paying attention to our emotions, being with our emotions, and learning about our emotions.
I love that. So really, what you're telling us is, getting more plugged into your emotions can really help you move through the flow of life with greater ease and effort or less effort.
Well, I think so without question, based on my own experience, but based on hundreds of people that I've worked with, that I've coached, that I've trained. Because if you think about it, we go to school, and in our traditional education, 95% of what we study is all intellectually based. We learn math, we learn science and literature, and those are phenomenal. I wouldn't take anything away from those. But what it means is our attention is so focused there that we really haven't put any attention on emotions in any organized way, right? Part of the reason, and I think this is so interesting, part of the argument for sending kids to school, right, is, well, they learn to socialize. Well, what's socializing about? Well, it's about emotions, right? It's about, we hope our kids will learn that, but we don't really have a very good process for teaching them. It's changing right now. I see us in a big time of change with this, both with with leaders, with educators, with parents. Everybody I speak to now is saying, oh, well, I did an EQ assessment and I get a sense of where I have strengths and weaknesses, but what do I do? Now, what do I do? And my answer is, well, you become emotionally literate, because there's something there, there's things you could learn and you could strengthen. And okay, now it's time to, I think, get into the trenches and really work with your emotions, because if you do that, then they will become tools that you can use. You will see them completely differently. You'll begin to see them as sources of information. You'll quit seeing them as positive and negative. You'll get much better at not judging them, but just simply observing them and noticing, oh, look, I'm feeling resentment. Wow, what's that about? I wonder why I feel resentment and what provoked it, and what do I want to do with it now? I notice I have it. Do I want to stay in resentment, or do I want to shift to some other emotion that I think would serve me better?
So it sounds like it's an opportunity to really discern in any given moment, what am I feeling, or what is this emotion? And then actively being in choice around, does that serve you well, or should you choose differently?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, one of the things we've confused, I think, is that many times if an emotion is uncomfortable, we tend to label it as negative. So if I feel anxiety, I label it as negative, or if I feel jealousy, I label it as negative. And often our reaction is we want to get rid of that emotion because it's uncomfortable. In my view, the discomfort is that emotion trying to get our attention to say, hey, Dan, right, here I am, notice me, notice what's happening to you. It's not necessarily for us to want to get rid of it. But because that's our reaction, oftentimes what we do is we try to avoid the emotions that are uncomfortable, and we try to get more of the emotions that are more comfortable. And what that tends to do is it does take away the choice, as you're calling it, because we're no longer in a neutral position to say, you know what, I feel jealousy. What's that telling me, and what do I want to do with what that's telling me? And so absolutely, it gives me a choice. I can stay there. I can stay in that emotion to see what emerges from it, or what it's trying to tell me, or to let it do its work, you might say. Or I can say, you know what, in this moment, that doesn't really serve me, and so I'm going to shift to a different emotion because I believe this other emotion will serve me better. And so we're always in this choice. And I would say that, it's it's I don't see situations where we're uncomfortable in emotion, and just because of that we should try to get rid of it. No, it's like, okay, get used to the discomfort, because some emotions are uncomfortable, but you know what, they're there for a reason. They're not just there by accident. They're there to help us in some way.
Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think so often when we get in those places of negative emotion, we do have an inclination as humans to want to shift out of that. I think you could go on to say that that is a birthplace of addiction and a lot of negative things that we don't necessarily want in our lives. But the reality is, it feels like we've been conditioned to not feel, as a human experience. And really, I think there's some catastrophic things that play out for that, that you see play out in the world, you see play out in people's lives. When you talk about emotional literacy and learning it as an active practice, it sounds hard. Like, walk me through, walk me through what are some of the benefits of, beside being able to make a choice, of somebody actively doing this work and choosing to become more emotionally literate? Like, how have you seen that show up in the people that you've worked with in a positive way once they've gone through the journey of making this a practice?
Yeah. Well, what it allows people to do, and this is very consistent with the name of your show, is to allow people to get unstuck or to not be stuck. Is often what happens is people, in my experience, will notice, oh, I'm feeling something. They may even be able to name the emotion, and this depends a little bit on their own learning, their own vocabulary emotionally, but they call it something. But let's just say they feel anger, they feel jealousy, something like that. What they typically don't do, or it doesn't occur to them to do, is to listen to it, is to say, wow, well, what's that telling me? And then to think about, now, how do I want to respond because this emotion has shown up? So people tend to get stuck, I would say, in emotions because they don't see that there's another possibility. So, for instance, is that, I have people who sometimes I work with who, as we go into the conversation, we begin talking about their emotions. It turns out, let's say that, they're feeling a certain amount of disappointment with something. Well, they tend to stay in the disappointment because, well, that's what they're used to doing, right? They're not used to moving beyond. But if they understand that what disappointment is simply you having an expectation or a hope that's not fulfilled, or that you suddenly realize is not going to be fulfilled, what it tells you about is, well, what are your expectations? What are you making up about how the world will be? Or what are you making up about how somebody else will behave? Because unless there's a promise on the other person's part, that's all it is you've invented a story about how they're going to behave. And so disappointment, what it can allow you to do is, when you understand that that's what it is, then you can get clear that, oh, I'm making up that story about that person. It's not really that person that I'm thinking about. It's my story about that person. And so actually what it can allow you to do is have a different conversation with that person, which would be, what, I want to know what to expect given, our relationship. So tell me what you see. Tell me what you promise. Tell me what you plan or expect. And so we can have a very different conversation. And one of the things that takes away often is blame. We often quit judging people or quit blaming people as quickly because we understand that, oh, the disappointment is mine. It's not theirs. They didn't cause it in me. They did something and it didn't match my expectations. So I feel disappointment. So what it takes away is many of those things that get in the way of relationships, whether it's blaming people or judging people or just not seeing people for who they are. So I think that's one of the biggest things. It allows us to have what I would call really clean relationships with people, to get clear on, okay, what do you promise, and what are you going to do, and now here's what I'm going to do. And even if I notice that I begin to feel some disappointment, I can ask myself, well, what's that based on? Is it based on somebody not fulfilling a promise, or is it just my expectation? And 95% of the time, in my experience, it's just my expectations. It's just my story about how they're going to be, how they're going to behave, or what they're going to do.
Well, and I love that, because we're really, if I look at that simply, it's about taking personal responsibility in the interactions that you're having in your lives. And it sounds like through that discernment, there is an ability to be responsive versus reactive, which I think so many of our expectation conversations come from a reactive place of, this is going to happen, or this person has done that for me. And really, like anything in life, when we own our own role, I think it's so much easier to make a smooth path. I want to get into next a topic that Dan is working on that really inspires me, that I think you guys will resonate with, called imposter syndrome, which is something I know a lot of us suffer from. Dan has a course called Moving Beyond Imposter Syndrome. I would love to know what the spark of inspiration was. First, what imposter syndrome is in your expert language, and then what the spark of inspiration was for that course.
Yeah, well, they came together. What happened was, I usually teach courses that are kind of general information. Here's emotions, here's how you can work with them, but they're not topic driven. And I had somebody who took a course with me, who I talked to, and she told me she was very hesitant to put things on social media, on LinkedIn, or to publish things, or to offer classes. And she said, actually, a lot of her friends as well. And she was, around 30, in her early 30s. And she said, I think their fear is nothing they have to say is worthwhile. And you should teach a course on this, because they have what I think of as imposter syndrome. And I never had used that term before, but as I started studying it and I started looking into it, I realized that it's a kind of catch-all. There's a long list of behaviors that people experience, that they have ways they do things that tend to show up when we talk about imposter syndrome. And the first thing I learned, which I was really surprised about in a way, was that it's not an illness. It's not listed anywhere. It's not in any reference, any medical dictionary. What it is it's not like depression. It's not, like bipolar disorder. No, it's really just a catch-all name that kind of sounds like it might be one of those, but it's really not. What it is it's a way that we've developed of seeing ourselves as not being enough, or not being enough as a human being, not being sufficient, not being as important as other people. And the list of behaviors that tend to fall under this, when I work with people, I always ask them to describe their experience with this thing we're calling imposter syndrome. And it's things like, saying yes when they would prefer to say no. Like, they feel like they're obligated to do things. They don't have a choice. Another thing is they tend to put other people first at their own expense. So not putting someone else first out of service or out of love, but really, in a way, out of sacrifice, out of denying themselves, and because they think the other person is more important than they are. So they tend to apologize often for things that don't really merit an apology. They tend to compare themselves with other people very often, particularly around things like intellect, beauty, success, etc. social skills, and they always come up short. Everybody's smarter than I am, everybody's more successful than I am, and they have a story that they keep repeating to themselves, which is they're not worthy, they're not valuable, they're not important, they don't matter. But it can come with a lot of different articulations. So there's not just one way that people articulate this. But what I've seen working with it is that we tend to have developed this view of ourselves, this belief about ourselves. There may be a number of sources, and one source can be in our family, for instance. I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and inevitably my parents, there were comparisons. And even if there weren't, I was always comparing myself to my sisters who were much smarter than I was, so I was always doing that as well. But I had my sister's teachers, and they said, "Oh, well, your sisters are so smart," right? Well, what did that tell me? My story was, "Oh no,
You're not as
I
smart
better
as
be
they
as
are.
smart as they are," and I'm not. So, I'm in big trouble here. But it can be, on the football field, the baseball field. It can be, it happens everywhere. But it can also be because of who we're made to be. For instance, if you're a certain color, if you're from a certain culture, if you're female versus male, is that, well, you're made a certain way. And, just the fact that women are not paid equally to men. Well, the message that you can take from that, you can either say, well, that's a societal issue, or you can say, oh, well, maybe I'm not as important as a man.
Right.
And so even if you don't
Or
want to
is
believe
valuable.
that, sometimes, you hear it so often. You hear it so often that you begin to believe it. So you begin to build this story that you're not as valuable on the level of human being as every other human being. And you tend to then build this sense of devaluing yourself. So it's interesting because for me, that's really what I run into most of the time with people. It's a way they've learned to think about themselves, it comes from many sources, and then they continue what they learned when they were young by comparing themselves, by seeing themselves as less than. And it doesn't happen to everybody from the same circumstances, right? People from the same circumstance can grow up with this, or they can grow up with a sense that they are as valuable as every other human being.
I'm wondering if we put different language to this. I mean, imposter syndrome is such a great way to talk about it. But as I'm listening to you here, is it also, perhaps underdeveloped esteem or a lack of confidence?
Yes, those as well.
Okay.
The other thing is I would say it's very connected with what I call self-doubt. But self-doubt, not that I can't do it, but that I'm not worthwhile, that I don't have value. And when I work with people, we always make a distinction between doubt as an emotion and self-doubt. And doubt means, well, I doubt if I can pick up that suitcase because it's probably heavier than I am strong, right? I don't think I have the capacity to do something. But it's about actions. It's about doing things. I doubt that I can get there on time, right? Well, okay, that's not about my quality as a human being. That's about, am I able to execute something? So that's doubt for me. I don't know because I haven't done it. But self-doubt is when I question my value as a human being. I believe that maybe I'm not as important as everybody else. And so what do? I defer to them. I take care of them. I let them go first. I apologize. All these behaviors that I was described. So I think it's very connected with self-doubt. I think that, low esteem would be another way to say it. But I think, again, there's a lot of ways we can describe this, but the fundamental belief that I run into over and over is a person believing they don't have as much value as every other human being at the level of humanity.
Well, and I'm guessing at a certain point in most anybody's life, somebody has had this feeling or can identify with feelings that might resemble imposter syndrome. I'm assuming I know the answer to this, but I'd love your take on it. Your training on emotional literacy, I'm thinking, is a major component in helping heal or remedy imposter syndrome. If somebody's listening and they have had a similar experience with this, how do you move beyond imposter syndrome?
Yeah. Well, let me go back to your first point, which is, I've read statistics that 80% of people have had this at some point in their lives. I think part of the difference is whether it's a passing belief. We go through times when, we may question our value, but
Right.
when it becomes your mood, when it becomes a way you see yourself day in and day out, I think that's when it gets to be problematic. So it's very widespread. But for me, the solution is to think about, what's the emotion that allows you to see yourself as worthy, as valuable as anybody else, to take a stand for yourself, right? To defend yourself, to defend your boundaries, to say what you believe. Well, the emotion for me that fits the bill is dignity, because dignity comes from a Latin root, which means worth. It means you believe without any question in your worth. So you're not more valuable than other people. You're not less valuable than other people. You are worthy at the level of everyone else in this world. So what we do is we often, in the work I do with people, is to explore dignity and what does it look like? What are our thoughts when we're in dignity, or our beliefs, like I'm enough, I have value, I'm a great offer, right? I decide for me. These are all things that we tell ourselves in dignity. And also there's a somatic component. There's a body component to this, because our body is the container for our emotions. And you can think about somebody in resignation and you can see them all limp and collapsed and looking at the ground. And you know what resignation looks like in the body. You know what joy looks like in the body, right? Well, we just need to develop the body of dignity to support the emotion. So that's the direction I go with people, is to, let's work with dignity. Let's strengthen dignity and see how that has an impact on this sense of not being worthy.
I love that word as a counterbalance to unworthy dignity. I think that's a really powerful word. And frankly, I can't think of a time where I've heard it used in relation to human emotions. I think about values. I think about integrity. But dignity has a different resonance to it. I like that. It feels choice based. Like I have a choice in this moment to choose how I'm going to show up.
Yep. Yeah,
And what I'm
absolutely.
going to accept for myself or not.
Yep, absolutely. And the other piece is, some people think, well, if dignity allows me to take a stand and say what I believe, well, then, that's going to get tiring for some people. Some people aren't going to like that, which is
Right.
true. But in dignity, what's interesting is what I care about is taking care of me. Yeah, I'm not opposed to anyone else. I'm just taking care of me. And people sometimes confuse that with selfishness or arrogance or some other emotion. But I would say, if you think about it, in in life, who can take care of you besides you? There's really nobody who can take care of you in the way you can take care of you. So this ability to take a stand for yourself means you know what you believe, but it also means you may choose to not say it, because that's also dignity. For instance, if I were to, I think something, I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily have to say that out loud, right? I can say, oh, okay, this is my belief, or this is my judgment, or this is my whatever. But it doesn't mean I'm being insincere if I don't say it. I'm making a choice. And my choice is to say, you know what, at this moment, that doesn't serve. And so for me, that's dignity. It's me standing in dignity. It's also me treating you with dignity. And one of the most fascinating things about dignity, I think, is that when we stand in dignity, when we're connected with dignity, by default, we cannot not extend dignity to other people. It's part of dignity, right? That we treat other people, that we honor their dignity and their right to choose. And seeing it in this way and working with it, then it makes so much sense to me. Well, why were people like Martin Luther King and Mandela, and why are people like that so Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa, why are people like always talking about dignity? And I think, well, this is why, because it's about you taking care of yourself, you being the best human being you know how to be, but also extending that right to other people and defending that right for other people.
Right.
Wow, that's really powerful. There's no other emotion that does that I'm aware of.
I love that. And if, as I'm listening to you, what I'm hearing in my head is it really becomes a practice of self-care.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For me,
Taking care of oneself. And I don't know that there's a time that most of us are taught the value and importance of caring for oneself in a really wholehearted way. I think affirmations are a thing that are pushed upon us. Like if you practice your affirmations, you're going to manifest. And, manifestation to me is another buzzword like anything else. Like I do think we have the ability to maneuver and create things in our lives. And it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about here with emotional literacy is really born of being kind to yourself first.
Well, that's a big component. Most people I work with are not particularly kind to themselves. They're often much kinder to other people and almost always kinder to their dog than they are
Isn't that
to themselves.
fascinating, though?
And, but it's something, yeah, well, again, I think there's a lot of confusion because for some people, they've either been taught or they've learned, they've made sense of, oh, well, if I'm being nice to myself, then that's either, laziness or that's selfishness.
Right.
I think, well, not necessarily, right? I mean, taking care of myself can be an act of care, self-compassion. So I think that we have to go a little bit deeper than we've gone with emotions. And the other thing is we have been taught certain things. If you think about, you've been taught, if you're in a circle of friends who are, I don't know, they're doing drugs and you say, just say no to drugs. Well, that's taking a stand for yourself. But what we haven't done is we haven't connected that in the way you're speaking wholeheartedly with dignity. But what would it be if you truly embodied dignity? It wouldn't just be about, saying no to drugs. It would be about knowing what you want, making choices for yourself, taking a stand for yourself, and also being able to, balance all of that with your relationships with other people. Because dignity is one emotion, but, there's all the other emotions, service and care and love and compassion that also need to get balanced off with whatever emotion that, we're in.
Well,
so yeah, it's a lovely dance.
And in the example you just gave, it may be the discernment to recognize that these are not your people. Having dignity in that moment may be these are not your people. I don't know. I do find even in my own life, I mean, I certainly have struggled with this a lot. And I look at it from the perspective of really subscribing to the servant leader model. And it occurs to me sometimes that when your natural inclination is to show up and serve others, it is really easy, unless you stay in an active process of self-care and self-support, to leave yourself off the list. And, it occurs to me that if I am not doing a good job in my own life of taking care of my own needs, a lot of times it will feel like I am pouring from an empty cup. And that is not the goal of this, to pour from an empty cup, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the stories on the street about emotions is that empathy is good. Empathy is always good. Can't have enough empathy. Leaders need empathy. I hear this quite often. What empathy as an emotion for me is when I can and when I do experience the same emotion as somebody else. So in essence, I'm seeing the world exactly the way they're seeing it. I'm feeling what they're feeling. I feel their pain. Right. So that for me would be empathy. And a lot of times, because we haven't distinguished it from other emotions, let's say compassion, which is my ability to be present with you while you have your emotional experience, is that people tend to be drawn to close connections with other people. They often go into education or healthcare, or they're coaches or therapists, or, lots of different professions have to do with helping other people or being with other people. The problem is if we only have empathy as our emotion, it's exhausting because we're always outside of ourselves. We're feeling the emotion of everybody else, and we're losing our emotional center. So a lot of times in that case, I introduce, the question, well, what about compassion? What's the difference between empathy and compassion? And let's go to the root and let's look up where they came from, and let's have a conversation about what are these two emotions that both have to do with the way I connect and the closeness with which I can connect with another human being, but they serve different purposes. And people, it's interesting because many people who are coaches or teachers say, what, I thought I needed more empathy. And now I realize I have so much empathy that's what's exhausting
I
me.
need to dial it back.
Yeah, it's not that I need to distance myself, but I need a different relationship. I need a different emotion for me to allow me to continue to do the work I'm doing, because otherwise I feel drained. I feel exhausted. So empathy has a role and it has a place, and it's it's an amazing emotion, but it doesn't serve every situation in a relationship with another person. Many times it's actually not very helpful. So this is what the value of emotional literacy is. We see the palette, we see the possibilities, and we see that empathy and sympathy and compassion and pity are all related, and they all have to do with how close or distant we are with another human being. And if we have all four of those available, we can choose the one that's going to serve the moment. And the moment may change. And when the moment changes, we can shift the emotion. But it makes us more agile emotionally. And it helps us deliver or give to other people what it is they need. Sometimes my wife needs empathy. Sometimes she needs compassion. Sometimes she needs sympathy. And sometimes she wants pity. Well, okay, those are all fine. But if I don't know the difference, how can I give those to her or her to me? It's like we're mute emotionally because we don't have the distinctions.
What I would love to talk about a little bit more is this range of emotions, a healthy range of emotions, that if somebody has done this work to discover emotional literacy and gone through it, how does one show up with a healthy range of emotions in? Like, what is the output of this work in someone's life that would be the fruit of doing the work?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first would be that you can articulate precisely what emotion you're feeling. And again, we throw a lot of emotions together, calling them the same things. We call anxiety, apprehension, fear, frustration. We call them all, apprehension, or we call them all anxiety. When really they're not all anxiety. Is that they're all different, they're all unique, and they all have a unique story, impulse, purpose. So the first thing is, your emotional vocabulary expands enormously, and when it does, you can then articulate more clearly what your experience is. But along with just naming the emotion is naming, what's your belief that's creating that emotion. So it allows you to have very different conversations as well with yourself for one, but with other people for two. And I think just that, one of the things I've discovered is that every human being that I've worked with, from children up through, much older than me, everybody has emotional wisdom, as I think about it. I mean, they know that they have emotions, and they know emotions have to do with their energy and their body and how they feel. But what they're lacking is the ability to articulate that emotion. So what we're really helping them with is this literacy part. We're not teaching emotions. We're helping people learn to notice and name and articulate their emotion for the sake of being able to be a choice with them, as we were saying earlier, and to use them to navigate. How do you plan for a meeting or a conversation that's coming up that, by default you feel anxiety about? Is that the best emotion? Is that going to serve you? Or could you create a better interaction with that person from a different emotion, from compassion or curiosity? Or you've got 200 or more to choose from. So I think what it just gives us a tremendous fluidity, fluency with emotions. You hear emotions differently. When you watch movies or when you listen to people, instead of listening quite so much to the words, you begin to listen to, what's the emotion driving this conversation? What's the emotion that's underneath of this? What's their real care? What are they really focused on that's coming out in this way? And that allows you to make different offers to people, to help them solve their problems, to understand them better. So I think in general, it just produces an amazing platform for interactions, for relationships. And when you read studies that say things like people like you and me, if we haven't done this work, our emotional vocabulary is about 20 words. Because what we do is we use those same. What are you not using? I mean, think about the range. It's kind of like
There's a
saying,
lot of them, I'm guessing.
it's like saying, well, yeah, we want you to paint a mural, but you only get, the primary colors. Well, okay, but what about mixing those colors? What about, yeah, there's so much more richness to it than that. And so I think part of it is the richness, part of it's the excitement of, going into a territory that most of us don't know very well and discovering, wow, look at how much power there is in this territory. Not to manipulate, although you could, and many people have, but more from my perspective to create the life that I want to create peace in my life, to notice when I'm bored and that I can generate some excitement or bring a little adventurousness, or, that I can regulate my life based on my emotions, including, the color of the walls in my house and the food I eat and the relationships I have. They're part of everything. So if you aren't fluent with emotions, you're missing out, or you're doing a certain number of things blindly.
Well, it definitely does sound like an active process. What I'm also hearing in the process is it's an opportunity to listen more. If you're more in touch with your emotions as you're engaging with people in your world and circle of influence, it seems like there's a more seamless way of being able to engage with them from an active listening perspective also. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And with myself as well, for me, just this morning I was talking to somebody and I said, I felt a little guilty about not doing more work on something. And later I thought, is it really guilt? And I realized it wasn't. I was disappointed in
Right.
myself that I hadn't done more. It wasn't guilt. And I thought, oh, well, that fits. That's right. I feel disappointed in myself. Well, it's okay. It's not the end of the world, but what it helps me understand is what I'm experiencing. I expected myself to do more. I didn't. So I feel a little bit of self-disappointment. But again, what it allows us to do is to not get stuck, right? Is to, instead of being caught in the emotion, oh, I feel so guilty. No, wait. It's not even guilt, it's disappointment. Oh, it's
Right.
disappointment because I had these expectations. So now what I do? Well, maybe I could look at how do I set my expectations of how much I'll get done, right? So I can resolve an issue for myself that previously I might have thought, oh, I need to see a counselor for. And, it's a tiny little thing, but it's true in many, many ways. What I find is that, a huge percentage of the things we think may be challenges we need professional help for, actually, they're probably things we could resolve on our own if we had the emotional literacy to do it and the emotional fluency and agility. So I'm not saying, let's give up the professionals. I'm just
Right.
saying, what, we could do so much more for ourselves, and we could live, such a more productive and contented life if we had these emotions as tools, which we all have.
Well, and the good news is there is a soft place for people to land because you've got the School of Emotions that has many courses and books that you've written about this. Tell us a little bit more about, if somebody's listening and they're interested in this concept of emotional literacy, what would be an appropriate next step for somebody to explore or to look at?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've done is created a number of things. So the books came first, and then some emotion flashcards, and then an iPhone app and courses. And, I think all of that is available. And also, I'm always happy to speak with people one-on-one is, what's going on in your life? What would you like to learn?
Right.
Because some people learn better in groups and group conversations. Some people learn better by reading. Some people, learn better through, an iPhone app. It doesn't, whatever appeals to you as a methodology of learning, I would say there's something available. And I would not put it as a task. I would put it as an adventure. It depends. You get to choose the emotion you do this in. I would say adventurousness would be a great one. What are you going to discover if you just were to go out there and, turn over some rocks and see what's there? And some of it may be a little bit uncomfortable because it's new. It may feel a little awkward. But I would say, the suggestion I give to people is get in the conversation and stay in the conversation. So it could begin here with our conversation, but then, pick up a book or call me, or let's have let's interact, and, but go look for it, knowing that it's available to you. Where would you be comfortable enough to begin?
Well, and I love that your meet people where they are approach, which really, and I use this language all the time in the work that I do myself of, how people are going to relate to the information that you're giving them. It's different for everybody. For some people, it is one-on-one. For others, it's groups. For some, it's self-study, reading a book, connecting with an app. And I think that flexibility in this day and age really, it kind of takes away the excuses that we make for doing the work. I'm not saying that everybody's going to get connected to it immediately, but I love this approach of recognizing that, we all may have a different nuance in our own life and approach it from a different lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope that, our conversation today has planted some seeds, and, when they sprout, who knows, and it might be years from now, and that's fine. But I would say, if there's even a little bit of curiosity about this, or a little bit of, if your brain's nagging you just a little bit, well, maybe I should look into that. Take a look, because I will tell you that it has created a completely different life for me, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. But also I see it happen, time after time with the people that I work with. Again, I don't think it's just because of me. I think it's mainly the work and the learning that they see the value of, and then they begin to put the work for themselves in their own lives.
Well, I'm so grateful for you being a steward of this work on a topic that I feel needs a lot more attention than it gets. So if anybody that's listening here today, Dan, tell them how they can get connected with you and your work.
Easy to find me on LinkedIn, Dan Newby. You type in Dan Newby, LinkedIn. That's a really simple way. The School of Emotions is schoolofemotions.world rather than .com, .world. And I'm Dan at schoolofemotions.world. So you can write me an email directly. You can go to School of Emotions website. There's a contact form there, but please be in touch with me. There's not that many Dan Newbys in the world, so it shouldn't be too hard to find me.
Well, isn't that lucky for you, Dan? I love it.
It is lucky. Yep.
So if you've not yet subscribed to Get Unstuck Radio show pages, you can find us at Get Unstuck Radio on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Next week, we have another inspiring guest, Brian Evans. Brian is a board-certified executive leadership and business coach and corporate consultant. For more than 3 decades, Brian has guided individuals and organizations, assisting them to achieve greater measurable outcomes, improve their lives and the lives of others, and inspire humanity to do and live better. Dan, before we wrap things up today, can you tell me one thing you're grateful for?
I'm grateful for stumbling into this work when I needed it most. And I'm grateful to be alive at this time when it seems like this is of growing interest and people are seeing the need and the value for it. So I'm grateful for life, but I'm also grateful for my work.
I love that. And thank you for shining your bright light and doing this work that needs much attention. Again, the champions like you that are doing this work are so valuable and important. Until next time, remember, every journey begins with a next step, and you too can be your own champion.